I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
I was out this morning doing meetings in the sun because it was 10 degrees centigrade.
You're insane. That just doesn't sound warm at all. What is that, like 50 degrees?
I don't know. It's not much, though. It's not much. It's still long sleeves and trousers weather. But this afternoon, Joanna was at home as well, and we decided, because I had a sort of relatively free day, and there were various bits and bobs we needed to do, and we had a bit of sun-kissed bravado, that we would go to IKEA and buy a load of shit. But we decided this at like 3 p.m. And we were like, yeah, we can rent a van, get to IKEA, buy a load of shit, come back to pick up Evie from nursery.
Sounds like a great plan.
It was a close run thing, let me tell you. It took a lot longer than we planned. And also, like, my hastily assembled list of like, yeah, it's all in stock. We'll go. It's in stock.
At least you went in with a plan. I usually just kind of go like, we might need a bed, you know?
So that's what I'm doing after this, is I'm going downstairs and
Wow.
assembling those shelves for 8 till midnight.
Is your kid a really good sleeper?
Once she's out, she's out. She's really hard to rouse when she's out. She's down for the count. Yeah, she's like her mum. She's a heavy sleeper.
God.
I set off the house alarm this morning and she didn't wake up.
You are joking.
We stayed up quite late last night watching The Mandalorian because she's really into The Mandalorian, which is great, and I'm totally
That's
fine
amazing.
with that.
You must be so proud.
I am very proud. Every time Grogu's on screen, she's like, oh, he's so cute. She just can't contain herself. Anyway, because we were up quite late, she slept in, and I must have set the alarm off at like 8:30, 9. And Joanna came downstairs, and then an hour later, Evie went to nursery at like the middle of the morning.
God. What time does she normally go?
If it's my turn, 8 on the dot. I'm taking every penny that I pay for from that place.
Yeah,
I'm
man.
not-
My kid gets
not
dropped
losing.
off at between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, and we do not pick up that little cutie patootie until 4 p.m. Anyway, speaking of capitalism.
Speaking of massively exploitative capitalism and sending the people you love far away, I want to talk to you about this Ulyssia. I'm not going to ask if you've heard of it, because I know you have. Because this is the second time we've done this.
Because listeners, or listener, we just can't get our shit together.
So this was a thing that caught my attention this week, and I'm going on something you once said, which is that if something feels a bit weird and odd, just stop and think about why. There's quite a lot to this, and I think it connects with a lot of different things, so it's worth going into. So Ulyssia is a project to set up a sort of super yacht, and we'll get to the dimensions later, but I mean a really big boat on which people can buy permanent residency for eternity, for the rest of their lives. And as you might imagine, with such a setup, it is predominantly aimed at the ultra-wealthy. So the Ulyssia is currently going through funding, spearheaded by a guy called Frank Binder, who's the heir to the Merck pharmaceutical fortune. Interestingly, I found out in doing this research that Merck can trace their roots back to 1668. It's going to be 320 meters long, with 119 residences on board, starting at 10 million euros.
My God.
With a yearly maintenance fee of about 3% of the value. For the starter homes, that's 300,000 euros a year, with interiors designed by Lenny Kravitz. So I read a couple of interviews with different people involved with this thing as I was getting into it. So Ulyssia will be loaded with the latest high quality equipment, such as X-rays, MRI, CT scanners, and ultrasound equipment. You might imagine what type of particular demographic might need that much medical equipment on board. And it's going to have some pretty top-notch security as well. So ex-Mossad security services, that's the Israeli special forces, are going to be providing security, including snipers for when they're going through places like the Gulf of Aden. It's going to have methanol fuel, nuclear fuel, biofuels, and solar, all to power it. So I read 2 interviews, one with Frank Binder, the founder, who very much pitches this whole thing around, you know, this is for the ultra wealthy, but it's for people who are looking for something different. It's people who are looking for a proper adventure. It's people who sort of, you know, for the man who has everything, basically. And then I also read an interview with Renato Cizola, who's the senior vice president for Ulyssia, but formerly, and put a pin in this one, he used to be one of the people behind The World, which is a similar other project, which I'll get to in a second. His interview was particularly interesting. So it's on this ship, there's imagined to be a focus on community and sort of self-organization to some degree or another. So he said in an interview You have your foodies, you have your divers, you have your sailors, you have your art collectors, people that are interested in reading and book clubs. All these subcommittees will start to form on board and create a real sense of community. So there's this idea that it sort of becomes an internally coherent, self-propelled community project. It's not like a cruise where everything's kind of organized for you. And there's lots of questions over the sales pitch. So the interviewer was giving Renato a particularly tough time and saying, well, who's going to pay for this? You know, if you've got 10 million euros lying around, surely you just buy your own super yacht. Like, why would you buy something on this? And he said they want the freedom to do what they do at home, to run around with suits and jewelry. And if they are smart enough to say, I want to go see real scenarios, not luxury hotels, they can go to places where there's no luxury and see how the world really works. That's what this community wants. So there's a bit of like disaster tourism in there as well, right? Or not even disaster tourism, like normie tourism. Like, let's go see what the real world looks like from our 320 meter super yacht. I have to outline, by the way, I may have skipped over it. This thing is 320 meters long with 119 residences. You tell us what that is in old imperial measurements that the Americans use.
Okay, it's 1,049.87 feet.
Some amount of a mile.
Oh, God.
So it's 320 meters long. Now, the world's largest cruise ship is 360 meters long, but that has 6,000 people on board. This has 119 homes, so let's say 500. And that's 500 guests, by the way, not including the staff, which I imagine is slightly higher than a 1-to-1 ratio.
Okay.
So it's very spacious, I think, is we can safely say. It's a third of a kilometer long with 119 people in it. I mean, that's less dense than most of rural England, right? It's pretty sparsely populated. And there's also this lurking sense in Renato Cesalo's interview about this fact that the people might be coming because they feel somewhat under threat. So he talks about safety a lot, and he talks about the ex-Mossad people who are going to be providing the security and the snipers and all of that. And he says they're completely protected against any danger. The implication of it is that it might be you're escaping global instability or political distress or even another viral outbreak.
So this is for the folks who don't want to get on a spaceship to Mars. They just want to be out at sea, not have to deal with any jurisdiction from any state government.
Yeah, the demographic is actually about the only thing that's incredibly clearly thought out in this, to the point where they have actual statistics. This is brilliant, right? So you immediately went for the space bros, right? But that's not who they're talking to. They don't want those people.
Oh.
They're nouveau riche. Nouveau riche, too common. He's got a very particular and borderline racist entry policy. So Rosato is asked by the interviewer, how will you stop criminals basically just buying a 10 million euro apartment, like someone who just wants to get into international water and have their base there, like a Russian gangster or something. And he says, I'll read this whole quote because it's very enlightening. There's a very tough background check before being allowed to buy. So can it be that a Colombian drug lord or a Russian weapons dealer comes and says, am I going to take 10? No, that can't happen. We're not a community for people from mainland China who don't speak English and want to spit around, or aggressive Russians. We are not a community for sheikhs from any Arab countries, and I have nothing against Chinese and Russians. I love everybody. I've been everywhere, but they just don't fit here, and they won't come. So this is who he does want. And this gives you a picture. And bear in mind, this whole operation is coming out of Monaco, right? We want like-minded golf players, tennis players, joggers, bikers, F1 drivers. We will have roughly 30 to 35% European, 30-35% North Americans, including from Canada, possibly a few from Mexico, a few from Sao Paulo. Then we'll have about 20% Australia, South Africa, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. Then we expect to have about 10% of people from all over. We don't know where. Could be anywhere.
Wow. So it's a lot of your distant cousins, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's European old world money. That's what they're looking for, right? If you look at the Instagram page for Ulyssia, it's all like parties with, minor Habsburg royalty from...
Why is Lenny Kravitz designing for this? I'm very disappointed.
Why? He's probably making a lot of money from it.
What a sellout.
And Lenny Kravitz is a good guy. I don't think there's anything inherently bad about this.
Well, it feels a little elitist and not very inclusive when we're thinking of futures. Do you remember when we were tinny binny foresight researchers and there was a bunch of tech firms. I forget if it was the Googles or the Metas. For the folks who couldn't get visas into the States, they wanted to essentially have these ships out in the middle of nowhere on the ocean so that they can have all these tech workers, right? And so that they also wouldn't have to deal with the jurisdiction of the US government and whatever other entity was trying to kind of regulate. It's giving a little bit of that, just a tad, but it's also giving this thing of we're not actually interested in trying to collectively help remedy the planet. We're trying to escape and make sure we can have a good party on a Friday night.
There's a couple of things there. To the good planet point, Frank Binder makes some very loose sort of philanthropic gestures throughout his interview where he talks about going to places where maybe they have a doctor on board or whatever it is, but you don't need a 320 meter super yacht to do that. You can do that perfectly well with existing infrastructure.
Yeah.
To your former point, I think that there is an interesting thing there I hadn't considered. So seasteading, hugely popular in mid-2000s Silicon Valley tech boom. I mean, it's been an idea that, you know, goes back centuries, arguably, this idea of like a civilization afloat on the ocean. Probably thousands of years if you go back to the idea of Atlantis as Plato reports from Socrates. But seasteading was a lot of it was Peter Thiel saying that the US government's migration restrictions, as you said, were too harsh and they're going to take all their money offshore and they won't have to pay tax, they won't have any visa restrictions, and they'll run their companies offshore. So the idea was then they would move the actual companies and the actual work offshore. In this case, the work and all the money is onshore. You're just living like one step removed from it. So there's similarities in this idea of somehow living outside of the jurisdiction of state or industry power. But it's not to do productive work. It's to live an abstract fantasy, whereas you can run around in your suits and jewelry and go and see real scenarios if you want to.
Okay, so if we take this as a signal, right? We see a whisper of a potential future. If this thing is multiplied thousands of times, I can only imagine the amount of consumption happening on the oceans, right? That then impact ocean ecosystems, that impact a planet that I think is already struggling to survive. But I imagine the folks that they're targeting probably aren't saying this is our only residence. They're probably saying it's our primary residence, right? So what does that start to mean for like land use?
I'm gonna divert slightly, take your initial point that a proliferation of these is interesting. But I think in the scheme of global shipping, a couple more boats carrying people aren't going to make a huge difference. There's people pumping up ships all the time to carry goods all over the world. An indicator, a signal, if you like, of how much of an impact shipping has is I think in 2016, there was finally a law that went into force, a global law that went into force about emissions from cargo ships having to be reduced. And they were reduced, and the temperature got hotter quite markedly, quite quickly, because basically all the gases that these ships used to release were increasing the albedo of the Earth and reflecting heat back. And as soon as they were out the atmosphere, or after a few years, once they dissipated, the temperature increased. So in the scheme of the global shipping world, I'm not sure this one ship makes a difference either positively or negatively, but it is an example of something that is an increasing trend. So this is not the only one of these ships. That's when I was doing my research, I started to really hone in on something. So for a start, there is only one extent ship in the world that has this kind of facility. So as I said, Ulyssia is currently in planning, and if it goes ahead, it will launch in 2028 at the earliest. But there is one called The World, which I mentioned earlier, where Renato Cesalo used to work, which has been running since 2002, almost continuously with permanent residents on board. Now, it's a slightly different story. So this is a retrofit of an old cruise ship, a cruise ship that was built in the 80s and was launched in 2002. It's the same crew as behind Ulyssia, as I said before, but it's not quite as bougie. There's 165 residents, only 196 meters long as well. So it's, it's 2/3 the size of Ulyssia. And security, similarly, security force of retired Gurkhas. Mostly a majority of retired or semi-retired business entrepreneurs and finance workers live on there. And what's really interesting, and what I find quite fascinating about it, and it goes to that community point, is that it is run as a co-op. So when it was launched in 2002, almost immediately the finances behind it collapsed because it's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
Like, who's going to pay for it? So to stop it going under, the residents bought it collectively and now collectively own, manage and run the world. So it is strangely an actual extent intact, internally run community run by the people who actually live there and own it, right? It's not run by some outside companies to which they all pay a fee and then, they take a profit. It's run by the people who actually work on there, which is amazing. So obviously one of the sales pitches for both of these things is this idea of being able to escape global troubles. But actually the world ended up being docked through COVID and having to disgorge all its passengers. So when COVID struck, it was around Australia. They tried to berth there and they were refused. And obviously tried New Zealand, and New Zealand had an absolutely zero tolerance policy, so they weren't able to berth there. Then they ended up in the UK, actually, and didn't go out to sea throughout the whole of COVID. So despite this idea that you could escape a viral outbreak or an epidemic by being on one of these ships, in fact, it's sort of the opposite. And there are others. There are other examples as well. The World is the only extent one. Ulysses is forthcoming, but there are other ones that are currently going. So The Narrative is another one, which is set to launch in 2027. Even more, so 530 residencies at 233 meters. The Villa V Odyssey is currently going, but only for 3.5-year cycles. So the Villa V Odyssey was delayed from its launch. It was supposed to launch last summer and ended up launching at the end of last year. And there was a series of interviews with people who were waiting to get on board the ship. One with an American woman called Shireen Thomas, who said, "I really believe in this wave of the future. Think about it as a floating city that can avoid pandemics, civil unrest, hurricanes, typhoons, and gun violence." So again, this idea that you're escaping. Now, Shireen Thomas isn't one of the ultra wealthy people who's going to be on board the Ulysses. You know, she sold all of her property and all, you know, took her life savings to take this opportunity. So there's this sense of both adventure and escape in there.
Yeah.
You know, which is interesting. Your Villa V Odyssey residence is about $99,000 with $2,000 a month in upkeep. So it's, you know, not incomparable to buying a on-land property.
Speak for yourself, Tobias. That's like barely a down payment over here.
I don't understand American currency. It seems wildly over and under everything it should be. It's like, yeah, this is 99 cents. Really? Okay. And this is $1 billion. Really? Neither of those things feel sensible. Don't you have anything in between?
I will say, like, architects forever have had this dream of being able to like design floating cities. So there is something really enticing about being able to protect yourself from the pandemics and things like that. And also to be able to have this life of adventure and see what else is out there. If we think back to the moving city, you know, Archigram's rendition of a flexible, agile city that shapeshifts to its users' needs. It's kind of like that, right? We've always dreamed of like these cities that can float, cities that can walk, cities that can move.
Yeah, and I think that's actually probably one of the most critical forces in that it is what I would call a pre-expected imaginary, in that everybody understands this notion before it exists. So like the flying car is a really easy example. There are no flying cars, but we all know what a flying car is because it's an imaginary we have from watching science fiction television or playing video games or whatever it is. And it is, you're right, the same for the idea of like the floating city or the city at the sea. So in fact, the world was built by a very famous Norwegian shipwright called Knut Kolster, whose father, also called Knut Kolster, he had this idea that people would just be living on these floating cities in the sea, that we'd return to this nomadic lifestyle where we're not anchored to one particular place and we're traveling all over the world. I didn't really realize until I was reading this, in my head, this idea of like the ocean liner and the cruise ship were kind of conflated. But actually, the cruise ship is a relatively recent invention. You had ocean liners, which were to get you from Liverpool to New York or whatever it was before planes could. And as soon as planes come, you don't really need to do it. You can just go on a plane and it's faster and eventually cheaper. But this idea that you just have a sort of dawdle on a big boat is sort of quite novel, right? That sort of comes out in the 60s and 70s. And the logical extrapolation is to tie that dream then back to all these precursors, and there are loads of them. So I mentioned Atlantis in passing, but it's one of those things that has its basis throughout 19th and 20th century fiction and science fiction. So there's several things I think going on in this signal which I think are really interesting. So one is the world is too unstable. You know, what does Shireen say? There's epidemics, there's gun violence.
Sea levels rising.
Yes, sea levels rising. The sea's a good bet right now.
There's going to be more of that.
My beachfront property in Florida, not so much. Pandemic, civil unrest, hurricanes, typhoons, gun violence. So there's this idea that there's safety, there's security, the sanctuary, the way that Renato Chisalo talks about it being guarded by ex-Mossad people, by Gurkhas in the case of the world. And then there's the sort of Lardian fantasy bit, the running around in jewels and suits, right? All the rules are gone. We don't have to pretend anymore that we're not wealthy. We don't have to be humble. We can sort out our fantasies. And when we want to dip into real life, we'll go and see how the other side live in real life. And then the final bit is this continuum of like, we've had this idea for a long time. And a bit like flying cars, we don't really need it. But if the capacity exists to build it, then someone's going to try and build it because it fulfills that kind of fantasy. And we are in this, strange utopian anti-pragmatism at the moment, like with a lot of stuff. I can think of a bajillion AI things where I'm just like, that doesn't make any sense. But you made it because you saw it in a TV show.
So there's something interesting you said about like Well, there's a couple things. One was that nomadic piece where I wonder what starts to happen if we kind of like follow the patterns of the planet. So if we're if we want to be exploring things around like ancestral or indigenous medicine, or rethinking or being able to travel to different places where there's better food sources or things like that, I think could be really, really interesting here. Basically kind of like following the seasons. But the other piece is, I wonder what if this becomes a solution for island nations like Kiribati, where like very famously the leaders of that island nation have for a very long time been, and I don't know if they've finally gotten status as refugees of climate change, but if our ability to live on land begins to depreciate because of what's actually happening to the planet, could the vision of the floating city actually come true for folks in a place, in a manner that's not as elitist and escapist, within reach for all of us like normies out there? 320 meters long and the amount of amenities, like that's a massive structure. There has to be new innovations that are being developed to even be able to build a thing like this, right? And so to be able to kind of like take those innovations and apply them in other contexts, I think becomes really, really interesting to me at least. But I don't know what you think about that, Tobias.
There's two things that are happening simultaneously, because the other half of this, and you're right, you mentioned sort of island nations. The Maldives are going underwater as well. In the British Channel, we have a migrant crisis of hundreds of people drowning every year trying to cross on small boats. You know, those innovations could easily be shared with those folks to save lives, but they won't be. This Ulysses project, if these indications are about it being sort of oriented towards survival through its security force, through its multiple sources of fuel, through its secrecy, we can file it next to projects of, you know, the billionaires building compounds in the New Zealand mountains to escape. It's a complete escapism, and it's a demonstration of a belief in a particular world that's beyond redemption, which the only thing you can do is escape from. You could spend the billions that I'm sure are being put behind a project like Ulysses on solving any of those problems we just mentioned, saving the lives of migrants crossing the channel, dealing with sinking island nations, even tackling climate change directly.
I think I'm almost treating this like it's a digital product. If you imagine like these first versions are insanely expensive and the innovations that are being developed aren't accessible to the masses, I can imagine that perhaps it's not the entire scheme of like having this floating city and this ship itself, but there are maybe like material innovations and like structural considerations that are being made to be able to bring something like this to light that can then be rehashed in ways that feel more economically within reach. And then we figure out how to make them less and less expensive. And so to kind of like, you know, pivot away from the like elitist, escapist kind of angle, or the piece where, you know, it's for the adventurers and the folks that want that sense of security in a world that's dying. What are the lessons that can be gleaned and the innovations that can be pulled off of the development of a system like this?
You know, I think you're right. And I think there's definitely something in there. But again, I would say there's plenty of innovation going in other parts of the world in maritime stuff. Lots of interesting work on hydrogen fuels and sailing and solar power. The real site of innovation is in passenger travel, is shipping. It's moving goods, because that's where the money is, not moving people, because people can move by plane. What struck me, that profile of the particular people, the styling of it, the sort of allure of it, has actually a kind of almost a pre-anti-tech fancy to it.
It does.
There's an element of it which is, it's for people who, I think you said people who wouldn't go to Mars. I think it's for people who don't understand the Mars thing. People are just like, what is this? Like, I just want to hang out with the Duchess of Tewkesbury or whatever it is, you know, and play polo.
They're going on the Facebook.
So I think there's a weird anti-techness to it. So that was weird. But then it was getting into, there's a couple of these all going on. And then finding this little chat with Shireen Thomas that really struck me. Because this wasn't someone for whom 10, 20, 30 years ago, this would have even been a even plausible fantasy to be like, I'll just sell up everything I own and live on a ship for the rest of my life because I'm sort of terrified of the world and really want to have an adventure. That's what's almost jumped out to me, is like the ultra rich and the sort of fantasists have been doing this sort of thing forever, whether it's Mars colonies or New Zealand. It's when, for someone who might otherwise, you know, live in a nice retirement village somewhere in, you know, I'm going to say Florida, whatever, and, you know, go to a casino once a month and whatever it is that American retirees do, they're like, no, I'm going to sell up everything and do this thing because, you know, I'm quite scared of the world. And this is now a possibility because the trickle down effect, you're right. If there has been innovation, it's this trickle down effect where this becomes more feasible. So what I'm saying is, where the Ulysses maybe has years of investment and design, and Mr. Kravitz is involved doing his thing, presumably with leather and gold. These guys are much more like, we just want to get out of here. We just want to get on the sea, and we don't care, really. We'll buy any cruise ship because you can just live in it, right? As long as we keep it supplied with stuff, that's fine. We can just live in it. That's almost the innovation, is the trickle-down effect of this thing that would have been unfeasible is now sort of every day for people like Shireen. This is just a real thing that they could do. But it's driven by a mix of anxiety and a multiple 100-year-old fantasy.
That's interesting when you start to envision what happens if lots of elderly or retired folks around the world start to use this as an option. It's a very foreign concept for me, because like culturally, that's just not a thing, right? Your parents get old, they come and live with you. That's just kind of the expectation. So this idea that, when folks hit retirement age, they can live on a ship and live out their life. I don't know if it feels fun, but I think it could be fun for some.
It tells us something, interesting about the socioeconomic condition that a Western retiree person finds themselves in, right? Where it's like living longer, got a load of time ahead, and that time doesn't look very pretty, frankly. My money's not worth a lot because the housing market's shot to shit. So what am I going to do? I'm going to escape. I've got 20, 30 years of unemployability ahead of me, because I didn't get on the Mars train. Now I got to go to live on this boat.
That sounds like fun. Even the lease term for the Ulyssia was like 50 years, and it was transferable. So I imagine you can pass it down to your relatives or something. But that's a wild commitment. Well, I was going to ask you, Tobias, is because we've discussed quite a few different kind of paths into this. What feels like the most pertinent?
Ulyssia is the sharp end of a general sort of socioeconomic fantasy that suddenly found itself being thrust into life as a result of fears of global pandemic, fears of gun violence in the case of Shireen, and extreme weather conditions and things like that. The availability of these ships, this fantasy that's existed for hundreds of years, if not thousands, suddenly being able to exist. And the positive, I guess, I took away from this, and what I really like, is that in the case of the world, it did quite naturally become a self-organizing commune. It could easily have not have done, right? It could have been a bunch of Karens who just went, well, this is garbage, took all their money and ran away. But instead they went, no, we'll sort it out. We'll dig deep and we'll make this work. We'll build our own community. We'll build our own system. We'll manage our resources and our time. And we'll, set up various councils as a really great social experiment to say that you could put all these relatively wealthy, well-to-do, quite independent people inside a ship that's financially falling apart, and then pull their socks and britches up and be like, yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll sort it. And we'll make it work and we'll co-own it. That's quite an optimistic thing, I think. I was quite excited by that.
I wonder what the demographic breakdown is on that ship. Obviously, socioeconomically, it's a collection of folks who could afford to be on that, but it still felt a little bit different than kind of the folks who would be opting in for the Ulyssia. And so what are the ingredients that you need to put together to have a community that is self-organizing, self-sustaining?
This is something that's a slightly tangential note, but, this is one of the problems I have when people talk in quite a nebulous way about building communities. In the Deweyan sense, communities assemble around issues. They have to have something that they want to change or affect. You don't just have a community for the sake of it because people live near each other or whatever, right? It's not a sustaining system. Whereas they have a project they want to maintain and protect, which is the ship. They want to keep the world moving because it's theirs. So their investment in that community is selfish rather than anything else. It's about their investment, the money they put behind it, the effort they put to have their home, their fantasy that they can go to when they need to. It's not a great profile. So one of the, we'll maybe end with this. One of the residents that I do know lives there is Gina Reinhardt, who's Australia's richest woman and also eugenicist, racist, and Trump supporter. So the profile is a mixed bag.
But do you see what I mean? I think it just begs the question of who decides.
If I'm honest, I expect we'll never see the Ulyssia. I think it doesn't add up as a sort of proposition to me. Sometimes when your common sense just ticks in and goes, it just doesn't add up. Why? Again, where's this money going to come from? Why would someone spend their money on this and not on their own thing? If any of those criteria were at play, I want to escape, I want to live out my fantasy, you just buy your own yacht and invite your mates. But that's to say, the idea substantially exists enough to have got this far and to have had this trickle-down effect on other projects, that it's still a meaningful thing, I think. And with that, my daughter is knocking at the door to tell me that my dinner's ready.
It's time to go.
I need to go and build some shelves. Anyway, it was lovely to talk to you about this for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, friend, let me go and
sit
in on calls.
Go and do your real job.
That sounds so fun. Bye.
See you later. Bye.